Hello everybody. So in this section we're going to talk about measuring working memory, and that's going to be the focus of this section. So one of the questions that early cognitive scientists were interested in is how much information can working memory hold? And one of the things that I want to point out, and I mentioned to and alluded to in an earlier section, is that our ideas of this, what we're referring to as working memory, have changed over time. And one of the interesting things is that the way that our kind of shifts in view have towards working memory have changed is really influenced by the way that it's been measured, right? So like a lot of things in life, the way that we measure something really kind of leads to our understanding of what it is. And so in this case, we're going to be talking about two specific tasks. So the first task that we're going to talk about is the digit span task. And here in a second, I'm actually going to provide an example of the digit span task and ask you to participate in it with me. Then the next task that we're going to talk about is something called the reading span task. And this is kind of a newer conceptualization of working memory. And then we'll kind of come back after you actually participate in the task and talk a little bit about what it tells us about working memory, but then also kind of historically, how does it show a shift in kind of our changing views on working memory? So before I get too far ahead of myself though, what I want to do is provide you with an example of what we call the digit span task. And so we're going to shift into that at this moment. Okay, so we're going to try a demonstration of one of the different ways that you can measure working memory, and that's something called a digit span task. And so for this task, unfortunately I can't replicate it with another person because of being in COVID-19 lockdown right now. But basically what's going to happen is I'm going to say either a number or a series of numbers to you, and then I'm going to say the word pause. And after I say the word pause, what I'm going to do is give you some time to repeat that number back to me. So let's go ahead and give it a try. 7, pause. 9, 4, pause. 2, 4, 8, pause. 5, 9, 6, 3, pause. 5, 8, 1, 9, 6, pause. 2, 9, 7, 3, 1, 5, pause. 1, 8, 4, 2, 7, 6, 3, pause. Seven, 4, 6, 5, 8, 3, 1, 9, pause. 3, 7, 9, 4, 2, 8, 6, 5, 1, pause. 6, 2, 1, 9, 5, 3, 9, 1, 5, 8, pause. Okay, so one of the things that you probably realized is that at some point as you were trying to go through this, the numbers broke down. Now, unfortunately, because of kind of the best way that I can handle things right now, I can't show you this demonstration and have you do an exact making sure that your numbers were right. But I gave a pretty extensive listing of numbers beyond what I know most people are capable of doing and accurately recalling to kind of highlight that point where you find yourself in that awkward situation where you hear the list of numbers and you're just like, I know, I don't know the answer to this. Like, I know I don't have this anymore. So, and don't worry, that's kind of the way that things normally go. So usually when I do this in the class, room, people remember 7 plus or minus 2. And I'll come back and talk about that a little bit later, but I just kind of want to give you a sense of what it feels like to actually be a participant in the digit span task. Now what's going to happen is I'm going to give you another set of numbers, and I want you to do the exact same thing. I'm going to list the numbers off to you, and basically what I want you to do is I want you to repeat them back to me after I say pause, just like we did before. And we'll come back to this and talk about it in the slides here in a second. 1, 4, 9, 2, 1, 7, 7, 6, 1, 8, 6, 5, 1, 9, 1, 2, 1, 9, 6, 9, 1, 9, 8, 5, 2, 0, 1, 0. Pause. Okay, so I'll admit, this one's a tough one. And again, once we go back to the slide, we'll come back to how that may not be as tough as you had originally thought, and also highlight one of the things that we know when we try to measure working memory using the digit span task. Now, one of the main findings that comes out of the digit span task that you just did is that the digit span on average tends to be 7 plus or minus 2 numbers. And so you might have heard of Miller's magical number 7. And so this comes from a researcher, Miller, not me, another researcher named Miller, who a long time ago found that when people did this task, on average, they remembered 7 plus or minus 2 numbers whenever you repeated it back to them. Now, it wasn't just numbers, right? They could do the digit span with letters or anything like that, but the key finding is that it seems like, at least according to Miller, the size of, in his time, short-term memory, but as we're referring to working memory, was 7 plus or minus 2 units. Now, what is kind of interesting is when I gave you that really, really long list of numbers, I wasn't purposely setting you up for failure. I kind of wanted to highlight another important finding. So you may have noticed that when I talk about the 7 plus or minus 2, I talk about 7 plus or minus 2 units. And the reason that I use units is because it's not really just that you can remember 7 plus or minus 2 items in working memory, but it actually is 7 plus or minus 2 what we call chunks, right? And so chunks can just be taking bigger information and combining it into different units. So I didn't give you this long list of numbers just to set you up to fail. One of the reasons I did it was to kind of highlight what it is that I mean by chunks. So most of you, probably about 7 numbers into it, realized that this number list was way too long and you weren't going to remember it. However, if you were a historian, or maybe you were trying to come up with some sort of a strategy to help you remember these numbers, you might have noticed something special in the numbers that could help you group them. So here I have highlighted in red, the first 4 numbers stand out to make 1492, the year that Columbus sailed the ocean blue. If you look at the next chunk of 4 numbers, 1776, this was the year that the United States was created, or the Declaration of Independence. And then you may have seen that the next 4 numbers were 1865, the year of the Civil War. And so one of the things that somebody might have done is actually take this really, really long list of numbers that seem impossible to be able to hold in working memory and actually chunk them into a number of different units that could help them remember it. Now, if a person were to do this, basically what ends up happening is that they wouldn't just remember 7 plus or minus 2 numbers in this case, they would remember 7 plus or minus 2 years, right? And so this is what I mean when I say chunk, where we take numbers and maybe break them down into meaningful units. And then what ends up happening with digit span is that it's really the number of meaningful units, 7 plus or minus 2, that people are able to remember. Now, kind of one of the interesting things, and if you ever find yourself kind of bored, there's this great book, I'm blanking on who the author is right now, but it's The Mind of the Numinist. And so Numinists are just people that have, or at least what seems to be extraordinary memory, right? So these are people that might be at sideshows, if those were still popular or whatnot, back in the time of the writing, this was the case, where they just are able to remember a lot of information. Now, in the study of that, basically what the researchers came to realize is that it wasn't that they remembered a ton of information, it was actually how they grouped or they chunked that information. So it wasn't like they had, or at least in most cases, extraordinary memories, but they were just much better able at chunking that information, putting it into some sort of a meaningful unit to them. So whether it's years, or it could be like weights of title fighters over the years, or whatever that meaningful thing was to them, that's what they're actually remembering. Their memories really aren't all that different from you or I or anybody that doesn't have an extraordinarily great memory. It's just that they're better at organizing that information. So Miller's 7 plus or minus 2, key thing to keep in mind here is it's not necessarily the number of numbers, but really the chunks of information that are important. Now, one of the problems with the digit span task, and also kind of one of these bigger issues that we've been talking about of the difference between short and working memory, is that people thought, as people and specifically cognitive scientists thought about how it is that we use this kind of short-term working memory, they realized that we don't really just kind of use it as a box, right? So the idea of the digit span is basically we have this sort of box of memory. And how much information can we store in this box? And the digit span does a really good job of measuring that, right? Basically, how many units can you fit into a box? But one of the things that researchers began to realize, and especially with the influence of computer science and this idea of RAM, where some of you might be familiar or not, but what the researchers began to realize is that's not really how we use this type of memory that would later term working memory. It's not really how much information we can store, but rather how much information can we work on at any particular given time, right? And so in the case of computer RAM, that's kind of what you're interested in. How many different things can your computer work on at the same time without freezing up? And that's basically the same thing that we're doing with working memory, right? We're basically actively working with these memories and manipulating them in different ways. And that's really kind of better reflects what we're doing when we talk about working memory as opposed to just storing small bits of information in some sort of a box. And so what this led researchers to do is develop what is called a reading span task. And so this is just another way to measure working memory. But basically in this reading span task, what happens is that a participant is asked to read a sentence, and then that sentence disappears, but they're at the end of the task asked to recall the last word in each of the different sentences they read. So we're going to try that here. And so what's going to happen is, if I can get the timing right, I'm going to present a sentence to you. What I want you to do is I want you to read that sentence out loud to yourself, and then I want you to remember that last word of the sentence. And that last word of the sentence is what it is that I'm going to ask you to actually recall. So let's go ahead and give it a try. Okay, so the thing that I'm going to ask you to do, and we'll go ahead and go back to that slide in a second, is recall for me the last word of each of those sentences. Go ahead and give it a try. If you want to write it down, feel free. And then just to check yourself, here are the list of the different words. So the final words were campfire, ground, followed, enthusiasts, lake, and God. Now, the reason that researchers kind of moved to this task and this idea of maybe instead of digit span, operation span, is that this task really requires us to basically work with the information that's presented, right? So one of the things that we have to do is we have to work with and read the full sentences. At the same time, the other thing that we have to do is remember the word and also do rehearsal maintenance to remember the final word of the previous sentences that we just saw. And you have to switch back and forth between these two tasks, right? You have to switch between reading and then also kind of remembering and rehearsing the final words so that when you're asked to recall them, you're able to recall them hopefully as accurately as possible. So that's an example of the reading span or the operation span task, and hopefully it's clear kind of how this takes a very different idea of this short-term working memory, and also kind of highlights why we consider it working memory. Because kind of what's important here, and this is kind of the current state of the science, is that it's not really how much information we can store, but rather how much information can we work with at a single given time and work accurately with that information. And that's actually what the reading span or the operation span task measures. Now, when it comes to the operation span, it does seem that this is actually a somewhat better measure of kind of this idea or this construct that we call working memory. So it does correlate really strongly with digit span task, meaning that people that have relatively short reading or digit spans also tend to have relatively short operation spans, and on the opposite side, people with really long digit spans also have long operation spans. But one of the things that's really interesting and what makes it kind of a better measure of this idea of working memory is that it's more closely or strongly related to other cognitive measures. And so one of the big things is success, right? So people that do really well at the operation or the reading span task also tend to be successful. And this probably isn't all that shocking, right? Because when it comes to people that are successful or people that have, say, for example, a high IQ, one of the things that allows them to have a high IQ is they're actually able to take multiple pieces of information at any given time and work accurately with those, deciding what is important to pay attention to and what isn't. And so it's probably not that surprising that the operation span or the reading span task is actually a better predictor of things like success and IQ than things like the digit span, where it's just how much information can we store in working memory at a given time. So hopefully kind of the idea of how we measure working memory is clear now, but then the other thing that should be clear is kind of historically, why did we change our measures, but then also at the same time of changing our measures, how we kind of think about this particular idea of short-term working memory. So hopefully that makes sense. If you have any questions or anything like that, definitely feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to answer them.